This is a hero. Heroes defeat evil demons and saves the world. This is a mercenary. They tag along and support where they can, usually by providing some supporting spells and keeping enemies occupied. But what if the roles were reversed? Can the mercenary be the hero and beat Diablo 2 while I am the sidekick? The rules for this challenge are simple. The mercenary is the only one who can deal damage and has to defeat every boss of the game. I'll talk a bit more about my role as a support later, but the main rule is that I'm not allowed to deal any damage to enemies, and the ultimate goal of this challenge is to beat all 3 difficulties of the game, from normal to hell. Can the rogue mercenary beat Diablo 2? I made a new character named after my favorite mercenary, but right away there was a problem. You can't hire a mercenary at level 1. You have to either finish the second quest by killing the rogue demon Bloodraven or level up to level 8. So technically no, you can't beat the entire game with only the rogue mercenary because you can't get one at level 1. But I allowed myself 1 kill and 1 kill only. I had to defeat Bloodraven to finish the quest without harming any other monsters. Consider it a rite of passage for allowing the Holy Paladin to be allowed to go to mercenary school. So I went out into the wilderness and headed straight for the burial grounds. Bloodraven was waiting for me, but so was her horde of undead, and more were coming. I ran right up to her and started swinging my sword. At level 1 I only had a 13% chance to hit her with every attack, but when my attacks did hit they dealt decent damage. Had it only been Bloodraven, this fight would have been rather easy, but I was quickly getting swarmed by the undead, and that was too much for me to handle, so I had to disengage and try to draw her away from her army. The fight was going alright, but suddenly I found myself out of potions and I had no gold to buy new ones. I could have gone into one of the crypts in the burial grounds and looked for chests, but instead I took a chance and rushed her, hoping I would defeat her before she defeated me, and I barely made it out on top. With Bloodraven defeated, I went back to town to claim my reward.
I can hardly believe that you've defeated Bloodraven.
Well, don't get your hopes up. That was the first and last monster that I will slay in this challenge. Now let me introduce this challenge's new main character, Amplisa, a level 2 fire rogue. There's also one with cold skills, and while those do add a bit of crowd control by slowing monsters, fire skills generally deal more damage, so I was happy to keep Amplisa. So from this point forward, Amplisa was going to do all the monster slaying, so what was I going to do? Well, I resumed the position of mercenary of course, but with a few extra rules. I was only allowed to tank for, heal, buff or otherwise support my mercenary. I was not allowed to deal any direct or indirect damage to enemies. Bloodraven did drop a little bit of loot to sell for gold, so before we started our adventure I got our new hero some gear to get started. I bought her a bow with a little bit of poison damage on it, a quite nice weapon for the very beginning of the game, upgrading her damage from 2 to 7 to 8 to 16. We went back to the Bloodmoor, and from this point on this is what saving Sanctuary would look like. I ran up to groups of enemies and Amplisa took them down. Hello? Amplisa? Oh, there we go. There are some quirks to the mercenary AI that I was going to have to deal with this playthrough. At first I thought being ranged would be an advantage for the mercenary, since she wouldn't have to worry about getting up to enemies before attacking, but it turned out to be the complete opposite actually. What would end up happening a lot of the time was that she would just awkwardly walk back and forth without the appearance of any plan of where to go. While she was struggling with that, I tried to remind myself to walk or stand still near monsters, because while running your chance of block is reduced, and since my main responsibility was to tank, blocking would allow me to soak up a lot more damage. I leveled up and got my first skill point, so let's talk about the reason why I picked the Paladin for this challenge. It's all about the auras. The Paladin's auras grants passive bonuses to himself and all allies in range. I picked the Might aura at level 1, which boosts damage by 40% and then another 10% per level, though it only boosts physical damage, and a lot of my mercenary's damage was poison at this point, but every bit helps. I knew before even starting this challenge that it would require a lot of patience, waiting for the mercenary to pick enemies off one at a time. But apart from that, the early game was smooth sailing. We cleared out the Den of Evil to finish the first quest, for the reward of a free skill point and the option to respec my build once in the future. I had found some gems at this point, and while a bow socketed with 3 gems would make a really strong weapon for this point in the game, I am a loot goblin through and through, so instead I put one of them into a socket in my hat for some extra magic find. And just for clarification, increased magic find on your character does count even if your mercenary gets the kill. Amplisa played the role of the hero well, and before I knew it we had made it through the first half of Act 1 and saved Deckard Cain. And after that I bought a scepter with +2 to the might skill, further increasing my damage buffing aura. I then found the Forgotten Tower and decided to grind the Countess for runes for a while, because while I didn't struggle right now, I was sure that we would later, and a nice stash of runes could be very useful. Getting down to the bottom of the tower took a while, because the narrow corridors with pillars weren't the best arena for Amplisa to fight in, but the Countess herself didn't pose much of a challenge. Except for when Amplisa decided to do constant, tactical repositioning in the middle of combat. I felt that my survivability was her main weakness rather than Amplisa's damage output, so I decided to spend some of my skill points into a defensive aura, Prayer. Prayer heals you and your allies for some health every 2 seconds while draining your mana, but I had just unlocked the Cleansing Aura, which in addition to reducing the duration of poison and curses also grants the same healing as your Prayer Aura, so it's basically the healing from prayer for free with some additional benefits. Now you can only have one aura active on your skill bar at a time, but it's quick to change between different ones depending on the situation. After farming the countess for around 2 hours, I had collected a decent pile of runes. Most importantly 2 Ral runes, which are both great in sockets on their own but also used in several good rune words and crafting recipes. And a whole lot of Tal runes, which grants lots of poison damage if socketed into weapons. Apart from walking around randomly a lot, Amplisa's AI had a few other issues we had to overcome in this challenge. One of them was enemies who heal or revive other enemies, like the shamans in Act 1. Especially if there were several of them, the fight could reach a stalemate where Amplisa would just kill the same fallen over and over, while the shamans just kept reviving them. I was still able to tank enemies fairly well, so for now one solution was to walk right up to the shamans and stare them in the face, as if you stand close enough to them they are likely to start hitting you with their knife instead of casting spells. Another issue in indoor areas was that she would sometimes get stuck in a corner somewhere and couldn't figure out where the door was. When this happened I could often just run ahead a little bit, and once I got too far away she magically teleported to my position. Another trick in those situations was to use a town portal and go in and back quickly, because that also teleported her to my position. We made our way through the rest of Act 1 with little issue, and arrived at the Catacombs level 4 and the first act boss Andariel. We cleared out as many of the other enemies as we could before engaging her, but eventually I stepped a little bit too close and drew her attention. Sigh, the restless tank pulling aggro too quickly, am I right, MMO players? But thanks to getting a bunch of extra levels in the Forgotten Tower and the power of antidote potions, we were able to defeat her on the first try. Before going out into the desert of Act 2, I spent some time shopping at the merchants in town. I managed to find these gloves at L6, and this might be the best magic find gloves I've ever bought this early in the game, with a perfect roll on the increased magic find and a really high resist roll on top. I also bought a belt for more potion slots and a pair of boots with even more magic find. I was going to have to balance my gear for more survivability eventually, but while I could afford to, I wanted to increase my magic find as much as possible for better loot and more gold from selling items to vendors. I also bought a new bow for Amplisa with 3 sockets, and as she had just hit level 17 I put 3 of the Tal runes from the Countess grind in it, creating a bow with damage far exceeding anything else I could have found for her at this point in the game. Just look at that jump in her damage. Now poison damage deals damage over time and it doesn't stack, so the numbers are a bit misleading, but still look at that big damage number. Thanks to her new bow, progress through Act 2 was borderline trivial, as she one-shot most enemies, even elites. The saying that the best defense is a good offense came to mind, as with her killing monsters so quickly, my duties as her tank became a lot easier. I had been reduced to a walking distraction with some marginal benefits from my auras. I had done it. I had become the supporting mercenary for Amplisa the hero. But since she was yet to muster enough free will to walk more than a screen away from me, I was still needed to complete this challenge. And we walked through the desert, stopping at various locations to collect quest items, like the Horadric Cube, the Staff of Kings, and the Amulet of the Viper, to finally make the Horadric Staff, which we needed to continue. Though I am omitting a lot of frustration with Amplisa's struggles to maneuver the many indoor and underground maps of Act 2 from the story. It didn't take long for us to find Talrasha's tomb. The next act boss Duriel was waiting for us inside, but before we fought him I went back to town because there was one thing I wanted to do before taking him on. It was time to finally spend some of that gold that I have saved up in my stash. A bit over 93,000 to be precise, but that was actually not that much for what I had in mind. Gambling circlets at almost 30k a piece. The reason I was willing to spend almost a third of my gold for a single gambled item was because at this point in the game there are some really strong stats available on circlets that you just can't get on any other piece of armor, with the main thing I was hoping for being elemental damage. My 3 gambled circlets resulted in one with 20% faster cast rate, which would have been great on any caster class but useless for this run, one with poison resist which just didn't cut it, and one with 11 to all resistances. Now that last one would have been a decent defensive upgrade for me, but if I instead sold it I could afford one more gamble. I couldn't resist, but I got another poison resist one, so no luck this time, but I will end up sinking a lot of gold into gambled circlets in the near future. So instead I restocked my health potion supply and made sure I had a skill point in the resist cold aura, which massively boosts your, you guessed it, cold resist, and went back to fight Duriel. With a decent chance to block, a very high cold resist and a belly full of potions, I was able to face tank Duriel while Amplisa whittled him down with her poisonous arrows. This fight was actually easier than I thought it would be, but it was not by a big margin that I was able to out-heal his damage, and this fight highlighted something that would soon become a problem for our current strategy. Poison damage just isn't very good against act bosses. But that was something for us to worry about in the future. For now we finished up our business in the desert and headed for the jungles of Act 3. But before I even stepped out of town, I power shopped Ormus until I found a staff with charges of the teleport spell. I couldn't use it yet at my current level, but it's actually easier to shop for this if you do it before level 24, because then you only need to check the red staves in his inventory. I stashed it for now, but this would come in very useful later. The jungle of Act 3 is everyone's least favorite part of the game, and I tend to be in a hurry to get past it. But with Amplisa having to pick off enemies one at a time, it was hard for me to rush through, since we would end up being surrounded by big hordes of enemies. So we cleared our way through the spider and flare jungle in a slow, uneventful grind, picking up Kalim's eye and brain in the process before we finally reached Lower Kurast. And here progress was faster and more fun again, and I had also leveled up to 24, which meant that I could use the teleport staff I bought earlier. This allowed me to reposition Amplisa whenever I wanted, to get her out of dangerous situations, or to get her in a position to better create dangerous situations for our enemies. Though I used this newfound power sparingly, because if I used it too frequently, the cost of repairing the charges of the staff would quickly add up to huge sums of gold. I mean yikes, that's over 2000 gold per teleport, and I desperately wanted to use that gold for gambling instead. Speaking of, a little later I did finally manage to gamble a decent circlet from Amplisa, and this was exactly the kind of circlet I was looking for. It maybe doesn't look like it added much damage, but again the damage stats were a little inflated from the poison damage, which is dealt over 5 seconds, while the fire damage is dealt instantly. And damage on the helm slot is so powerful because she would be able to carry it with her even if she upgraded her bow later. I collected the final piece of Kalim's remains under Kurast. Hello! And headed to Travancore, where we would have to defeat the High Council to continue. Our first attempt ended quickly as they got their hands on Amplisa, and I wasn't quick enough to swap to my staff and teleport her to safety. Though once a few of them were drawn out from the rest, we could comfortably pick them off a few at a time. I struck the orb like I was playing Castlevania, and we headed down into the final dungeon of Act 3, the Durance of Hate. This place can be a real challenge, especially in later difficulties, and I was worried about how Amplisa would be able to handle the environment, but we were blessed with a really lucky map, and we didn't have to wander around for long looking to find the stairs. I mean, just look at this map for level 2. On the third level we first took care of Mephisto's bodyguards, and I made good use of my teleport staff to move Amplisa away from the fire, but then I stopped paying attention to her and she got sniped by Hydras anyway. Whoops. One trip to resurrect her later, we were about to fight Mephisto himself, and I was really curious to see how well we would handle this, because in a lot of my playthroughs Mephisto kills my Mercenary right away, and then I have to raise Mephisto's damage with my own, hoping to defeat him before my health potions run out. But this time I had to tank his damage long enough for Amplisa to take him down, and she had to survive too. And well, it was a tough fight. I could take a few of his hits, but if I got a few unblocked hits in quick succession, he dropped me really low and I had to walk away from him to try and regain some of my health. The problem was that as soon as I did so, he turned his attention to Amplisa, and she couldn't tank even a couple of his spells. I had to resurrect her several times during this battle. One time I didn't even have time to draw Mephisto's attention to me before he killed her again. But I managed to stay alive, and resurrecting Amplisa was not too expensive yet. This was by far the most difficult fight yet, and unfortunately it was a sign of things to come. But eventually we took Mephisto down. The rare armor that Mephisto dropped turned out to be a quite nice one, with life, 2 resist rolls and 2 open sockets. In Act 4 the monsters were tankier and some of them had really high poison resistance. Amplisa's damage was still decent, but it felt like the effectiveness of her poison bow was starting to fall off. Enemies also dealt a lot more damage now, and my tanking capabilities had not kept up at the same rate. This was a sharp increase in difficulty for us, and we had to move around and retreat a lot more during combat. But for now it didn't stop us, it merely slowed down our rate of progress, and we continued through the barren plains of Act 4. We encountered Isuel in the Plains of Despair, and even in normal difficulty he is very tanky. I could only dream of one day being a fraction of the damage sponge that he was. I actually timed this fight, and while I was never in any real danger on the front line, it took Amplisa 2 minutes and 46 seconds to wear him down. Just a little benchmark so that the reality of how grindy this challenge was becoming isn't lost in the highly edited final video, because it was already a very grindy playthrough. Though it was still well worth it, because the quest reward for killing Isuel is a whopping 2 extra skill points. This allowed me to unlock another great defensive skill for the Paladin, Holy Shield. Well, technically it's available already at level 24, but I had forgotten to put points in all of the prerequisite skills, so I had to wait for another couple of skill points. Holy Shield increases your shield's defense and block chance for a limited amount of time, making you able to tank physical damage better. And of course, it also makes your shield glow in the dark. but with a mana cost of over half my total mana pool and only a 30-second duration at level 1, I only used it when I really needed that extra block chance for the time being. We then made it through the River of Flame, heading for Diablo in the Chaos Sanctuary, with a short detour to destroy Mephisto's Soulstone at the Hellforge. I was really hoping for a good room before taking on Diablo, something like an Ort room would be simply amazing, but my hopes and dreams were soon shattered with the drop of a Neph rune. The Chaos Sanctuary marked yet another increase in difficulty, mainly thanks to the high population of Oblivion Knights. Luckily my resistances were all around very decent, and by taking it slow and being careful not to get overrun by too many enemies at once, we patiently clear out the entire area. And the times when we did get swarmed by too many enemies despite my best effort, the teleport staff on my weapon switch was put to good use to get us out of immediate danger. Vizier of Chaos exploded. Lord Disease was defeated so one-sidedly that he went behind a pillar to die to avoid embarrassment. Though he did drop a Thal rune, which could come in handy later. And then the Infector of Souls, well, he turned out to be a bit of a challenge, chasing me far back towards the entrance of the sanctuary. But since we had cleared the entire area, there was plenty of room to kite them, and soon enough we took them down. Now I only needed to activate the final seal before Diablo would spawn, and I had no idea how this fight would go. On one hand, I did have a very high fire resist, decent lightning resist and a decent chance to block. On the other hand, the fight would probably take several minutes, and while I had some decent tools to withstand this damage, I was going to have to soak up a lot of it. And of course Amplisa needed to survive as well if we were to deal any damage to him, but there was only one way to find out. The fight started out pretty well. His health bar didn't move quickly, but it did move, and I was surprised to find I could take his fire damage and claw attacks really well. It started to feel like this would be pretty easy, but of course anyone who's fought Diablo before knew what was coming. His lightning attack deals a combination of physical and lightning damage, and lots of it too, and those two happened to be my two biggest weaknesses. I tried moving around him to avoid some of the damage, but I was too close and didn't move fast enough, so I fell. I tried again, but this time stayed a little bit further away from him and kept moving in anticipation of his lightning attack. But then he would target Amplisa instead, melting her in an instant. Things weren't looking so great anymore, but then I remembered another defensive aura that I had skilled but had yet to use. Resist Lightning. Just like the Resist Cold aura that I used against Duriel, this brought my lightning resist up to 76%, which was a big increase. I lost out on the healing from cleansing, but the 10 health that aura gave me every other second seemed pretty marginal for this fight anyway. I put on Resist Lightning and waited for him to try and zap me again, and that small change made a huge difference. I could now tank a full blast of his lightning attack without even losing half of my life pool. Of course I did have to constantly drink health potions to keep up with his damage, and I completely ran out before we even took off a third of his health. But at least this was a working strategy, and I knew that if I just had enough potions and patience, Amplisa would be able to take the Lord of Terror down. And with counting the times I went back to town to resurrect Amplisa and refill my potion supply, this fight took almost 10 minutes, but in the end we stood victorious. Starting Act 5 is oddly enough often a pretty big step down in difficulty. Compared to the Chaos Sanctuary, minions in the battlefield outside of Harrogath are weaker, deal less damage, and are preoccupied by random barbarians walking around, and they give good experience too. A bit of a strange turn of events after fighting Diablo, but a welcome one. We saved 15 captured barbarians for a quest reward of 3 runes, including that Ort rune that I wanted. Now I could put Ral, Ort and Tal into a shield to make the Ancient's Pledge rune word, which gives a very nice boost to all resistances. But the best shield that I had found so far was this large shield, and what I really wanted was a Paladin shield, because those can spawn with an additional completely free all resistance bonus, making them absolutely fantastic for rune words. The only Paladin shield that was remotely close that I had found was this one with 2 sockets and 10 to all resistances, so for now I saved my runes. But that turned out to be not that big of a deal, because after saving Anya from the frozen river, I went into the portal that she opens and defeated the mini-boss Pindleskin, and he dropped me a pretty good Paladin shield, maxing out all of my resistances. In the Glacial Trail I found a unique composite bow. I had been wearing a decent amount of magic find for several acts now, so it was nice to finally find a unique that was usable for this challenge, though the rogue's bow leaves a lot to be desired, to put it politely. The attack speed and deadly strike are very nice stats, don't get me wrong, but the base damage is just too low. We then continued through the rest of the act and arrived at the Ariat summit. We had to fight the ancients to continue into the mountain, and we took them on 2 on 3. They can hit pretty hard, especially if they coordinate their attacks, which only happens randomly. They are not coordinated at all. But between my 60% chance to block and a lot of health potions, I managed to keep both myself and Amplisa alive, while she slowly drained their health with her poison. Before not too long, the first of them fell, and once the fight was a fair 2 versus 2, it was over, because now they couldn't muster up enough damage together to really threaten either of us. Amplisa cleaned up the last 2, and when we finished the quest I leveled up to level 30. This unlocked a new skill which would become my main offensive aura. Fanaticism increases the party's attack rating, damage and attack speed, basically everything that an attacking character wants. I also unlocked 2 defensive auras, Redemption which turns fallen enemies into life and mana, and Salvation which gives a big boost to all your resistances. I didn't need more resistances right now, but I wanted 1 point in the skill for the future, just in case. The difficulty of the Wildstone Keep depends largely on what enemies spawn there, and it's different every game. This time I got lucky and didn't get any particularly dangerous combination of enemies on either floor. The Throne of Destruction was also mostly smooth sailing, until I faced Bale's final guardians that is. It should perhaps not come as a surprise that the final enemies before the act boss are strong, but there was a huge difference between Lister and his pack and everyone who came before them. Even though I was able to separate a few of them from the rest, they really overpowered us. They knocked me back all over the place, and even when I could stand my ground, I couldn't tank the 3 of them for long at all before I had to retreat and heal. And on top of that, Amplisa barely scratched them with their high health and 95 poison resist. Yes, that's right, 95%. In normal. I considered going back to farm a bit for some extra levels and hoping to find a better weapon for Amplisa, but I didn't want to reset the game and have to start the throne room all over again. So first I decided to see if maybe it was enough to get her a different kind of weapon which didn't deal poison damage. I gambled bows at Anya, and after about 50,000 gold gambled, I got this massive longbow of Gore. Now those damage numbers doesn't look impressive at all compared to the poison bow, but this was another damage type that they were less resistant to, and this bow would also benefit a lot more from my fanaticism aura. We went back for round 2, and while I was still slapped around aggressively, Amplisa dealt a lot more damage to them now. But now their high health regeneration was a problem instead, and without being poisoned, they healed their health back as quickly as they were damaged. After a while, I did manage to get one of the minions completely separated from the rest, and by switching back and forth between her poison bow and her new one in the middle of combat, she was able to keep the minion poisoned to stop the regen, while still getting the damage from her new bow. A bit more mechanically demanding than what I'm used to when playing Diablo 2, but this way we were eventually able to wear one of them down. But that was just a single one. Well, at least I had figured out a way to defeat them, but it required lots of luck to get them separated one by one, a lot of health potions and a lot of time. So instead I decided to use a bit of a cheesy tactic to bypass the rest of them. By luring all of them out of the throne room, the game will think that they're dead and trigger Bale to move on without having to defeat them. I generally don't like to use this trick in challenge runs, but this challenge was grindy enough as it was, and I can promise you there are still a lot of grindy fights ahead of us. As for the final fight against Bale, well, one of his spells are good at punishing spellcasters, and another one pushes you back and chills you to interrupt melee fighters. But against someone who was just happy to stand there and take you to the face, he didn't have the right tools. He just didn't have enough damage output. But that's not to say that the fight didn't still take a really long time, because he's very tanky and he likes to teleport around a lot, which messed with Amplisa's positioning. But after over 20 minutes of grinding, tons of health potions consumed, many revived mercenaries, and almost all of my gold spent, we finally defeated Bale and beat normal difficulty. And for our troubles, he dropped a unique bow, and I was extremely excited to see this because I knew exactly what this bow was. The Kuko Shakaku. Wow, what a great item to find on a run focused around the rogue mercenary. Plus the bow skills, great damage, piercing attacks, and always firing explosive arrows. Oh boy, what an exciting find. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a forgotten memory had started to resurface. For some reason, I couldn't help but think that there was something bad about this item in combination with mercenaries. And well, a quick search revealed that I was unfortunately right. Apparently the exploding arrows doesn't work when a mercenary uses the bow. It shows the visual effect, but the explosion deals no damage. This was of course a big letdown, but even without the extra splash damage, it was still a very good bow and would be a huge upgrade for her. In a few levels, because we had fallen a bit behind on experience by skipping a lot of enemies in the last part of the act. I was almost ready to enter Nightmare, but with that bow drop I decided to farm the missing few levels before I started the next difficulty, and a horde of demons slayed later, we both hit level 33 and Amplisa could wield their new bow. And just for comparison, here's what fighting Eldritch looks like with her new bow compared to her old one. Quite the difference, right? And while it seemed to hold true that the exploding arrows from her bow didn't deal any splash damage, those attacks still dealt her normal single target attack damage, and her own exploding arrow skill seemed to work just fine. So bugged or not, her new bow was a massive upgrade. And with that, we moved on to the next difficulty. Though despite that upgrade, Nightmare wasn't trivial by any means, especially difficult packs of elite enemies started to pose a real threat. And I'll take a brief moment to rant a bit about Amplisa's AI again, because as enemies got stronger it became very apparent that she was the cause of a lot of our problems. So many times Amplisa would decide to stop attacking during critical moments in battle and aimlessly walk back and forth when a well-placed exploding arrow or two would have won the fight outright. and whenever I encountered a strong enemy and ran up to them to tank them, creating space for Amplisa to attack from a distance, she would often instead join me in walking right up to the enemies. I thought that the teleport staff that I bought earlier would be a niche tactic for special situations, but the longer into the game we progressed, it started to become an integral part of our fighting strategy. But despite our differing definitions of a solid battle plan, we reached the Forgotten Tower and I planned to once again stick around for some rune farming. I was originally planning on really grinding this place to secure a nice bow upgrade for Amplisa, which was of course no longer necessary, but I still wanted a few specific runes before we moved on. After about an hour and a half I had found most of the runes that I was looking for. The main ones were Shale, Io, Tal, and Tal, Thul, Ort, Am for 2 very good rune words. But I had not been able to find the right base items yet, so let's come back to rune words once I find some bases. I also found a unique gothic plate in the tower. Rattle Cage's Crushing Blow, which while less effective on range attacks, could help against enemies with lots of life, like act bosses. It also has a chance to cause monsters to flee on hit, which is typically annoying, but in this challenge it could actually be a decent help to keep some of the heat off of me.
I'll put that to good use.
The Andoriel fight was a little sketchy, with my health pool bouncing up and down in big swings, and if I tried to retreat for just a second to recover my health, she chewed up Amplisa in an instant. But we did eventually take her down, and she dropped a pretty decent ring upgrade, with big cold resist, a little poison resist, and some baby magic damage reduction. But Andoriel would soon give me something even better. Throughout Nightmare I mixed progressing through the questline with going back to farm her, since I could take her down pretty reliably, and on one of those farming trips she dropped a unique round shield. Moser's Blessed Circle is a great shield with a big bonus to all resistances, a very high block chance, and 2 open sockets. I had 2 perfect diamonds waiting in the stash, and the Mosers ended up being quite an upgrade for me, maxing out all of my resistances even with a Nightmare penalty, and also maxed out my chance to block while I had the Holy Shield active. This was a little surprising to me, as I was 100% expecting to be wearing Paladin Shield rune words in this challenge, but I was certainly not complaining. And then on to Duriel, who could soak up damage decently, but not as well as me. Well, I guess I was drinking health potions constantly and he wasn't, but that's on him. We took the giant worm down and he dropped another Io rune and a unique ring. The ring was Ravenfrost, and if Amplisa had fingers this would have been a great piece of gear for her. It didn't seem too useful for myself at the moment, so I put it in the stash for now. I had still not found the required bases for the rune words that I wanted to make, so when I reached Lower Kurast in Act 3 I farmed armor racks for a while. And that turned into over 3 hours of looting armor racks before I found what I was looking for, but eventually I got a great helm with 3 open sockets, finally. I socketed a helm with a Shale, Io and Tal rune to make the rune word Cure. It might not look that impressive at first glance, but the key was the level 1 cleansing aura when equipped. Since cleansing carries the full healing from the prayer aura, we will get lots of passive healing just from me wearing this helm without having to have the aura equipped on my skill bar. And the best part was of course that I could then put Fanaticism on my right skill slot and have 2 auras active at the same time, no longer having to choose between offense and defense. And as a final bonus, the Cure Prayer combo is also a common way to gear the Act 2 Desert Mercenary, so it fit well with the theme of me being the mercenary to my mercenary. I went to do a respec to get rid of the skill points in Might that I hadn't used for a long time, and put as many points into Fanaticism as I could, 1 point each into Holy Shield, Vigor and Redemption, and had just enough skill points left to max out Prayer, giving me 25 life healed every 2 seconds. The only issue with fighting Mephisto was that he could still snipe Amplisa in 1 or 2 spells if he wanted to, so I tried my best to keep him occupied and waited for Amplisa to take care of the rest. Mephisto dropped another unique bow, and this time it was a Cliff Killer. That bow gave Amplisa a bit higher damage, but I decided that the 50% pierce on her current bow was probably more useful, at least for now, but I saved the Cliff Killer in my stash just in case. In Act 4 the difficulty spiked again, and I had trouble standing my ground and tanking even a handful of regular Venom Lords, despite my maxed block and max resistances. Though we had sped through a lot of nightmares so far and I was a bit underleveled, and it started to become clear to me that we really should keep up in level for this challenge. Not only would higher level mean more damage, resistances and a better chance to hit for Amplisa, but it would also give me more life and a better chance of avoiding enemy attacks. Though as difficult as Act 4 was, we took down Isual in just 1 minute and 20 seconds, less than half the time compared to normal, proving that the Crushing Blow on Rattle Cage was pretty good against big chunky enemies. The Nightmare Hellforge had the potential to make a big impact on this challenge if I could get lucky with something like an Lem or an Amp, but the Io rune that we got was unfortunately pretty much useless. But there were also some good things in Act 4. When I finally found a sword with 4 open sockets, I immediately went to make the Spirit rune word. While I didn't benefit from the faster cast rate, the +2 to skills, the extra vitality and the magic absorb still made this a great weapon for my Tankadin, and certainly a lot better than the rather underwhelming scepter with just +1 to fanaticism that I was wearing before. We did struggle a bit in the Chaos Sanctuary, but my new sword was a noticeable upgrade, and Diablo himself was a complete walk in the park, since in Nightmare in Hell his lightning attack completely misses you if you stand close enough. In Act 5 things continued to be a bit difficult but manageable. I separated the Ancients and fought them one at a time just to be safe, and as long as enemies focused on me and Amplisa kept firing, we did pretty well. But of course that was easier said than done as soon as we fought more than one enemy at once. And I can't stress enough just how important my teleport staff had become for this challenge. If I didn't have that tool to manually reposition Amplisa, I think I would have given up on this challenge a long time ago and scrapped the video. Just look at this clip from the fight against the first wave in the throne room, where I didn't use the teleport staff at all, just for demonstration. First she walks right up to the enemies instead of staying back to attack, and once she's close she completely breaks and just walks around, fires an arrow here and there, but mostly just walks all over the place as if she can't decide if she should run away from the enemies or fight, so she does neither. Beyond frustrating. But then sometimes she was completely in on my strategy and stood back and attacked continuously without moving, like in this example where she fired arrows constantly until Bale moved away out of her range, but even then she repositioned herself to a good position rather than running up to him, and then continued to just shoot. Very strange and inconsistent behavior. Oh well, we eventually took Bale down and finished Nightmare. Now on to the real challenge, in Hell. My resistances were decent but not maxed in Hell, and Amplisas were even worse. We entered Hell at only level 56, which wasn't great. In fact, it was quite bad. So before we even started, I farmed a few extra levels in Nightmare to level 62, finding a lucky East rune in the process. And then we started Hell for real. And at least in the Bloodmoor, things seemed fine, though seeing how tanky even normal zombies were made me anxious about some of our future challenges. Apart from more damage and more health, a big change in Hell is that most monsters are immune to one element, and fire immunes are quite common. That was bad news for us since a lot of Amplisa's damage was fire, so I made the decision to send Amplisa back to Rogue School for retraining. Amplisa the Fire Rogue is dead. Long live Amplisa the Cold Rogue. Now she had 3 different kinds of damage with physical and fire from her gear and cold from her skills, and Freezing Arrow also added a bit of crowd control, which was honestly very welcome, though it did make the big tanky cold immune enemies in the Den of Evil an absolute slog to fight through. I tested out Conviction instead of Fanaticism to lower the cold resist of those enemies, and while her cold skill certainly did better, the loss of attack speed and physical damage from Fanaticism was simply not worth it. The chance to cause monsters to flee on Rattle Cage was a really nice stat to have in Hell to keep me from getting overrun, because I was starting to have serious trouble tanking elite enemies. But after a long slow grind we killed the last monster in the Den of Evil, but struggling this much with the first quest was not a good sign. Desperate for upgrades, I headed to our old friend in the Forgotten Tower. The Countess was by no means an easy target for us to farm, even getting to her in the first place was a challenge, but a couple of good runes could perhaps turn things around. Luckily I could use a doorway to my advantage, but her cold immune minions were tough, and once we finally got rid of them, other minions kept interrupting the fight against the Countess, so we had to retreat over and over. This fight alone took over 5 minutes, but when we finally took her down she dropped a Ko rune, which was one of the runes that I was hoping to find, and after another couple of kills she dropped a Lem rune. I immediately went to my stash and made a treachery rune word for Amplisa. The chance to cast Venom is nice, but the main thing that I was after was the 45% increased attack speed. This armor together with the Fanaticism aura turned Amplisa into a machine gun turret. Unfortunately it didn't make her any smarter, but when she locked onto a target she dished out damage fast. This also meant that she lost out on the crushing blow and the chance to cause monsters to flee from Rattle Cage, but I think the increase in damage made up for it. I have personally never seen a rogue mercenary attack this fast. The upgrade was noticeable right away as it made the Countess runs much faster. I would not go as far as to say they were fast, but there was definitely a big difference compared to before. I also found a unique body armor from the Countess. Boneflesh wasn't going to be able to compete with the power of treachery, but since there are some monsters late in Hell that have crazy health regeneration, having a source of open wounds could perhaps come in handy later, so I saved it in the stash just in case. And shortly after that I found another unique. I was here for the runes, but I was not complaining about a pair of Tearhunch. I gladly traded in my rares for 10 to all resistances at this point in the game. Despite my max block chance, physical damage was my biggest weakness. Now using doors was a great strategy, but I felt like I needed a boost to my physical defense. The only decent rune word against physical damage that I could reasonably dream of was Bulwark, but that meant that I would have to give up the passive healing from Cure, and I really wanted to keep that. There was a long period of only Tal, Eth and similar runes, but then the Countess paid out big with this Mal rune. Though as exciting as it was to find a rare rune, Mal is more rare than it is useful. I would really have preferred an rune, but it was not like I had a choice. I put the Mal together with a tear into a 2-socketed Ornate plate I had found earlier to make Prudence, thinking that the high defense might help against physical attackers. But that turned out to be a pretty big mistake. I completely forgot about the strength requirement, and I would need 170 to equip it. Now I had a respec available, but it would mean a lot less vitality for the Paladin, which was of course quite counterproductive in trying to increase my survivability. In hindsight, I should really have made it in an armor with lower requirements, but what's done is done and I had to deal with it. Now about Prudence, it's not the best rune word ever, but it does come with a decent boost to all resistances, though I got a fairly low roll. It also has 17 magic damage reduction as well as a less impressive 3 physical damage reduction. The armor maxed out 3 of my 4 resistances, so while it didn't help with my physical defense, I was going to be able to handle most elemental damage pretty well. I then went to try and shop for some new gloves, and then the D2R crashed on me. I think that is the first time it has ever happened to me in Resurrected, almost as if the game taunted me for my mistake with the armor. But soon after I found what I was looking for, some gloves with a good amount of fire resist, replacing the ones with cold resist that I had been wearing for a long time now. And I was more than happy to swap some cold resist for fire resist, because fire damage is both more common and typically more dangerous than cold damage. And I was also wearing the Ravenfrost ring, which has 20% cold absorb, which already did a lot to mitigate cold damage. After that upgrade, I decided it was time that we moved on and made some progress, so I didn't end up using that co-rune that I said was one of the runes that I was looking for. I intended to make Harmony or Hustle with it, but after finding the other upgrades, I didn't feel like I needed to, and I hadn't found any good bases to make Harmony in anyway. We defeated the Smith and brought the Horadric Malus back to Charcy. I had to imbue a rare tiara that I found earlier, and while it wasn't the best rare I'd seen by far, it was even further from the worst, and it was a decent upgrade for Amplisa. We made our way to the Catacombs level 4, and it was time to defeat Andariel one last time. We patiently cleared out all enemies we could without aggroing her, and then I used a cheeky little trick to buff my defenses that extra little bit before the fight. I borrowed Amplisa's treachery armor and walked into a fire on the ground. That soon triggered the Fade proc from the armor, giving me the Fade buff for the battle, even after giving the armor back. I lured Andariel away from the few other enemies still left in the room, and soon the battle assumed a steady state. Amplisa kept shooting at Andariel without being interrupted. Andariel kept swinging at me, and I kept swinging health potions. And that was the entirety of this fight. A prime example of the thrilling, action-packed gameplay we all know and love Diablo 2 for. Amplisa eventually wore Andariel down, and as a reward we found a unique crossbow. I got very excited for a second since this was the Burisa, but reality soon caught up to me, because rogue mercenaries can only use bows, not crossbows.
I can't use that.
In Act 2 the Maggot Lair was a chore as always, but at least I could relax for a while, because the same dirt walls that prevented me from running past our enemies also prevented our enemies from running past me to attack Amplisa, and the straight narrow corridors fit Amplisa well, especially with the 50% piercing attack from her bow. I could have teleported a lot more aggressively than I did here to save some time, but that seemed like an unnecessary risk and also terribly expensive. The Claw Viper Temple was a lot harder, not only because the snakes deal a lot of damage, but they also kept knocking me out of position, exposing Amplisa to danger. This forced me to use a lot of teleport charges to keep Amplisa alive, but with a little bit of patience and some good luck in finding the second level really quickly, we overcame this area as well. Soon enough we were ready to face Duriel, and once again I tried borrowing Amplisa's armor for a little pre-buff, but this time there were no fires for me to easily trigger Fade with, and purposely taking damage from enemies put me a little too close to death for my liking, so I instead pre-buffed myself by drinking a lot of thawing potions and headed down to Talrasha's chamber. Just like the fight against Andariel, it was super grindy, but not really challenging or threatening, except at one time when it got me down to 13 life, just slow. Clocking in at over 15 minutes, we defeated Duriel, got no loot for our troubles, and moved on to Act 3. In Act 3, fast enemies could quickly surround us both if I wasn't careful, but if I was careful and only got myself into just the right amount of trouble, Amplisa took care of all enemies in the jungle pretty easily. Even the fabled Sazark the Burning, who has humbled me on many challenge runs, was no match for her, but in the end I did end up rushing past a lot of areas rather aggressively in Act 3, and this was probably a stupid idea and I got very lucky. But hey, if it's stupid but it worked, I cheesed the council from the high ground, or well, that was the plan anyway. I ran into a lot of troubles positioning Amplisa so that she could reach them while I was still soaking up all of the damage from their Hydras, and their high damage meant that mistakes were punished quickly. But Amplisa's problem soon became mine, because I ran out of gold completely. Selling some gems and runes could afford me one more resurrection, but this was of course terrible news since I was 100% reliant on her, and I still had a good part of Act 3 left, and then the two most difficult acts on top of that, so that meant that it was time to pause the main quest and go grind some gold. I chose to begin the grind in the far oasis, because there aren't any cold immune enemies and Amplisa dealt mainly cold damage. Beetle Burst also always spawns there, so there was one guaranteed elite to target. And the other half of the grind we spent at the Countess again, which was harder and slower, but I was still dreaming of a few more runes. Gold and time-wise it would probably have been faster to go back and do Eldritch runs in Nightmare, but I decided to do the gold grind in Hell because some extra levels would also be very nice. We farmed for about 2 hours, gaining over 900,000 gold in 2 levels, but no useful runes or other loot. But at least that gold would be enough for over 20 Mercenary resurrections, so we went back to Act 3 for another try at the council. I got Amplisa in a position to shoot while all enemies focused on me, and she did decent damage to them. The problem was that they kept healing each other, and with that many of them there was just no chance for us to take them down this way. So instead we set up in front of the main entrance and started luring them out one at a time, eventually taking them all down. I felt a bit stupid because I should have done it like this from the start, especially considering that's how we did it in the previous difficulties. I was prepared for a long and grindy Endurance of Hate, but got a very lucky first floor and a pretty decent second floor as well. Battle Staff of Teleportation to the rescue, once again. Remembering the Duriel fight, I knew Mephisto would be another slow grind, but I also remembered the rattle cage that my mercenary used to wear before making treachery. So I brought both armors with me to the fight and started with the rattle cage for that 25% crushing blow, and that really made a difference in her damage output despite attacking much slower. Tanking wise, Mephisto wasn't an issue for me at all. I could stand and take all of his attacks continuously, only recasting Holy Shield and drinking a health potion once in a while. Once he was down to his last bit of health, I swapped back to Treachery and Amplisa to finish the fight, and soon we had defeated Mephisto. I was really glad that I have saved the rattle cage in our stash, because while the Duriel fight took over 15 minutes, the Mephisto fight with rattle cage took just under 5, and there were a lot of big tanky enemies left to defeat. The start of Act 4 was a lot of running and teleporting, because enemies here were hard but not very rewarding to defeat, though I did stop to take down Isuel since he had spawned alone at the edge of the map, and once again I swapped in Rattle Cage, because he's another big chunker. I really wish I had thought about this armor earlier in Hell. We also made sure to visit the Hellforge while passing through the River of Flame for a final shot at getting a good rune, and it dropped an Ist rune. That's the second highest rune that can drop from the Hellforge in Hell, and while it is a nice rune to get in a late game farming scenario, it's surprisingly useless when playing through the game, and now I had 2 of them. The Chaos Sanctuary in Hell was the toughest challenge we had faced yet, but that was of course no surprise. The only way we could conquer it was slow and steady, carefully thinning out their numbers a few at a time without getting surrounded by too many enemies at once. Just like in every other difficult area we fought so far in this challenge. I'm starting to sound like a broken record here. But the Chaos Sanctuary really had it all. Strong physical attacks, a buffet of magic projectiles, and fire-breathing demons. When we reached the center, I figured out that I could use the star in the middle to create choke points, kind of how I used doorways before when farming the Countess. Not a groundbreaking discovery, but I had never used the star on this map quite like this before, so figuring it out in the moment felt kind of neat. After dragging basically every monster in the last half of the sanctuary to the middle, it was time to take down the Seal Guardians. The Grand Vizier of Chaos was, and will always be, the easiest of them, but knowing this I stopped paying attention for a second and got very close to dying, but Amplisa was there to pick up my slack, 1 seal down. Next up was Lord Disease, which is significantly harder, but you can usually lure his minions away from his aura range, like I did here, and without his entourage he's much less scary. And then the last seal boss, Infector of Souls, which was the main reason why I was so intent on clearing out every other random monster from the Chaos Sanctuary before hitting the seals, cause in basically every challenge run he forces me to retreat back a long distance in order to separate his gang, and with how fast they are, that requires quite a lot of space. That is a very reliable strategy though, so soon we had defeated all 3 bosses and I activated the final seal to summon Diablo. And just like Andariel, Duriel and Mephisto before him, Diablo was slow, but not that difficult. At this point my defenses were good enough to tank basically any single enemy pretty confidently, with the only really dangerous situations occurring when there were too many enemies attacking me at the same time, or when enemies decided to start targeting Amplisa, and halfway through the fight, Diablo started doing just that. He took her down several times, costing me a couple 100,000 gold in mercenary fees, but eventually we won the fight and we moved on to the final act of the game, Hell Act 5. To be honest, at this point Act 5 didn't offer much useful for completing quests or killing monsters, so I put on my Vigor Aura and just ran for it. And I ran, successfully dodging my way past some pretty dangerous enemies, and I didn't stop until I found the area at Summit. But I didn't take on the Ancients just yet. The 900,000 gold that I farmed a couple of acts ago was all gone and I had less than 100k left. I was about to face the most dangerous challenges of the entire run, with the Ancients, the Throne Room waves and then Bale. So I was going to need a lot more than that for potions, repairing the teleport staff and some inevitable mercenary revives. So I embarked on what would hopefully be the final gold farming session of this challenge. I did a mix of Eldritch in Act 5, the Far Oasis in Act 2 and the Forgotten Tower in Act 1. But at this point I was kind of tired of farming, so just short of the 1 hour mark when I leveled up, I decided to move on. My gold pile was up to 422,000, which was a little more than 10 extra lives for Amplisa, though that was not much of a buffer considering the challenges that we were about to face. Then it was time to face the Ancients and I managed to get extra fast Talik separated from the rest, and while trying to get him to focus on me, I got him in a position where he was just swinging his sword at me without using Whirlwind. I guess it was because there was no space behind me. Well, that was a new one for me. I was learning lots of things in this playthrough. Spawning with Stone Skin meant he was tanky, but without Whirlwind he was barely able to put a dent on me, and soon enough we defeated him. Next I got my dog separated from Corlic. He was hiding behind the building, but Amplisa saw him and started shooting. Being fire enchanted and extra strong, he did make a significant dent in my life pool whenever he hit me, but with 75% chance to block I had enough time between hits to regenerate my health with health potions, and soon enough he fell as well. And then finally Corlic, who was cursed and extra strong, which is a super scary combination. One hit could take away almost my entire life pool and I was running short on full rejuvenation potions. Once my purple potions were out, I had to start running away as soon as he got a big hit in to let my regular health potions top me up. One leap attack here could have ended me, or if he had gotten a big hit on Amplisa, I'm not sure if she could even have taken one hit. But luckily, with just a couple of health potions left, we defeated Corlic and with him all 3 Ancients and could move on to the Worldstone Keep. And I was very thankful that the area at Summit is big enough that you can separate the Ancients from each other, because fighting all 3 I don't think we would have stood a chance at all. The Worldstone Keep level 1 had lots of dangerous physical attackers which we had trouble dealing with. I'm not sure exactly what my plan was, but I decided to try and run past them, and somehow by some miracle I made it through with my skin intact. The second level had much easier enemies, so we fought our way through this one. The snakes could mess up my tanking with their knockback, but for the most part this level was no problem. The third level was somewhere in between the two, harder enemies than level 2, but not as bad as level 1, so we fought a lot of them, but also skipped some of the more dangerous elite spawns. The throne room had souls, and despite having 80 lightning resist, I was not able to tank more than a few of them at a time, and their piercing lightning also meant that Amplisa could get zapped easily if I wasn't careful with my positioning, so we had to take on just 1 or 2 at a time, but not that many had spawned on our way to the throne, and after clearing out 2 mummies, 3 souls and 3 snakes from the final room, we were ready to face Bale's final guardians. The first wave was easy, but already at the second wave we hit some issues. The skeleton minions are cold immune, so Amplisa's arrows didn't deal that much damage to them. But somehow I managed to pull all of the skeletons with me when going back to town to refill my potions, while all the mummies stayed behind out of healing range. And once the skeletons were down, the mummies were sitting duck. The third wave was easy, relatively speaking, but the fourth a little harder. They chased us all the way back to the entrance, and we had to keep repositioning ourselves to avoid being completely surrounded, but unless they got a full surround they just didn't deal enough damage to me, so in the end it wasn't too bad. Now the final wave was a big worry going into the throne room, since I hadn't really done anything about my physical defense, and my worries were well founded because they smacked me around and drained my life pool in just a couple of attacks. Now Lister had spawned with the Might Aura, making things a lot worse, but it took me a couple of hours to reach this point from the start of the Worldstone Keep, so I wasn't ready to just give up. I went back to town and made a new armor with a 4-socketed ancient armor that I found earlier while grinding for gold, and I filled it with 4 soul runes from the Countess for 28 physical damage reduction. That was probably not enough against a pack full of might enchanted minions of destruction, so I also made sure to separate the group into smaller groups, because while they were very strong, they were also kind of slow, making them easy to manipulate. I'm not sure how much of a difference my new armor made, but by taking on just 2 of them at a time out of Lister's aura, it was a winnable fight. The minions were one thing, but I still had to conquer Lister, and he always had the Might Aura with him. In addition, he had also spawned with lightning enchanted, so he hit like a truck with both physical and elemental damage, and this fight didn't go well at all. I even went all the way back to Tristram and stood in a fire for a while with my Mercenary's treachery equipped to trigger Fade, but it just wasn't enough. I could take 3 to 4 hits maximum before I had to run away, and Amplisa couldn't even take 2 hits, so she died several times while I tried to heal myself. Eventually, I died to Lister as well, and at this point the fight was lost. I had burned through all of my gold and had to sell most of my gems and some runes just to be able to resurrect Amplisa again. But there was just no way that we could defeat Lister without any gold when he spawned like this. Well, actually with this spawn there was probably no chance for us to beat him, period, so I saved and exited the game, giving up all the progress I made in the Throne of Destruction. This was a big setback so close to the finish line, but there wasn't much to do about it. We had to recoup, prepare a bit more and then try again. And yes, I could have cheesed my way into the Bale fight like I did in normal, but after me and Please had been on such a long and epic grind of an adventure together, I wanted us to win fair and square, so that our victory would taste extra sweet. So after a brief gold farming session, I was up to a few 100,000 gold again, and then we went back to the Worldstone Keep for what would hopefully be our last attempt. Having to start over all the way back at the waypoint was painful, but it was what it was. At least now I had the map revealed, so getting back to the throne was a lot easier this time. The Throne of Destruction and the first 4 waves went similar to how it did the first time, except with Death Lords instead of souls this time, and before long we were once again ready to take on Lister. But first, one final preparation. I went back to town and made the Bulwark rune word. I had been doing some thinking while farming for gold, and while the passive healing from the Cure rune word was very nice, if I could only take a few hits it was not going to have time to heal me much anyway, and the damage reduction on Bulwark was probably going to be more useful in this particular fight. And I also just then realized that this has 30 replenish life anyway, so I should probably have done this swap a long time ago. And before going into battle with the Minions of Destruction once again, this was what my full gear looked like. The Spirit Sword for 2 skills, still rocking the Moser's Blessed Circle, which served me just as well now as when I first found it. A rare amulet with resist, Prudence body armor, but for the Lister fight specifically I swapped to the Sold Ancient armor. Gloves with fire resist, a magic ring with all resistances, a rare belt with lightning resist, the Ravenfrost, Tearhaunch boots, and an assortment of charms with mainly more resistances, including some pretty decent ones like this Fire and Life Large charm. And let's of course not forget our hero Amplisa, still using the Kuku Shakaku, which I actually hadn't socketed yet because I didn't know what to put in it. If I had found an rune, I would have put that in there for the open wound, but since she didn't need a shield rune for attack speed with my high level fanaticism aura, I let it be as it was. The rare tiara for a little damage increase, and the treachery armor. I also took both the rattle cage and bone flesh with me to the Lister fight, so I could have access to both crushing blow and bleed from open wounds if needed. I also ran back to Tristram to pre-buff myself with Fade again, and now I was as well prepared for this fight as I could reasonably be, apart from grinding several more levels or getting some lucky drop. We once again lured them back and separated a few of them, and this time Lister didn't spawn with any nasty auras, which meant that it was kind of easy to be honest. What a stark contrast to the previous attempt, and I could tank Lister pretty easily, kind of an anticlimactic turn of events, but I was just so happy to have defeated them. So with that finally out of the way, we headed to Bale for the final encounter. I put my Prudence armor back on for increased resistances, and I also swapped back to my Cure helm. Bulwark was probably a better option for me, but the cleansing aura from Cure also healed Amplisa. Bale is sometimes just a waiting game, but that was not the case this time. Despite me being right up in Bale's face, he would still frequently target Amplisa, and while I was beefy enough to tank Bale all day long as I had potions, Amplisa was a bit more fragile. So instead of a waiting game, it became more of a long drawn out mercenary management game. I had to sell off most of my runes and even do a little bit of gold farming in the middle of the fight for more gold to resurrect Amplisa. But all in all, it wasn't too difficult, but it did take a really long time, because there was so much interrupting Amplisa from attacking between the tentacles, Bale teleporting, his knockback cold attack and Bale summoning his clone. While Amplisa wears Bale down, I'd like to give a special thanks to the Battle Staff of Teleportation for making this run possible, and also a big thanks to all channel members whose support helps me keep Amplisa resurrected. I really can't do justice to just how annoying and grindy this fight was. From start to end, the final battle took over 1 hour. This is definitely the craziest Bale fight I've ever had, but eventually eventually Amplisa, the hero mercenary, defeated Bale, and with that, the final difficulty of Diablo 2. Well done Amplisa, and thanks for carrying me. If you want more grindy Diablo 2 challenges, check this video out. That playthrough actually took even longer than this one, mainly because I decided to do it with a melee barbarian.